The fluorescent lights hummed their familiar tune above Lieutenant Colonel Vasquez's desk, casting harsh shadows across stacks of flight reports that seemed to multiply like cancer cells. She'd been relegated to this windowless corner of Ramstein Air Base for 18 months now, her fingers dancing across keys that spelled out other pilots' victories, while her own F-16 gathered dust in a hangar she wasn't cleared to enter. The brass called it administrative reassignment. Everyone else knew it was career suicide in slow motion. The coffee in her mug had gone cold hours ago, but she sipped it anyway, grimacing at the bitter dregs while reviewing Lieutenant Morrison's after-action report from yesterday's training exercise. Morrison was 24, cocky, and had never seen real combat, yet somehow his mediocre performance required 3 pages of documentation, while her 20-year service record collected dust in some filing cabinet. That's when the shadow fell across her desk. She looked up to find a woman in an unremarkable gray suit, mid-40s, with the kind of forgettable face that screamed intelligence operative. No introduction, no small talk. The woman simply placed a red folder marked Eyes Only next to Vasquez's keyboard and slid it forward with 2 fingers. "You weren't supposed to be here," the woman said quietly, her voice carrying the weight of classified conversations and buried truths. "The desk job, the grounding, the whispers in the corridors about your mental state after Kandahar, none of it was coincidence." Vasquez's hand froze halfway to the folder. Kandahar. Even the word felt like swallowing glass. 18 months ago, she'd returned from Afghanistan with a chest full of medals and a head full of ghosts, only to find herself systematically stripped of flight status, purpose, and respect. The official story was pilot fatigue. The truth was something else entirely. "Who are you?" Vasquez whispered, though part of her already knew the answer wouldn't matter. The woman's smile was thin as paper. "Someone who knows what really happened over the Panjshir Valley. Someone who knows why you were pulled from active duty 3 days after you filed your incident report. Someone who needs a pilot capable of flying missions that don't officially exist." Vasquez stared at the red folder. Inside lay either salvation or damnation, and after 18 months of typing other people's stories, she wasn't sure she cared which. Her fingers traced the folder's edge, feeling the weight of secrets that could either destroy her completely or give her back the sky she'd lost. Outside, she could hear the distant roar of jets taking off without her, their engines singing the song she'd been forbidden to join. The intelligence operative checked her watch. "You have 30 seconds to decide, Colonel. After that, I walk out of here, and you go back to filing reports until they force you into retirement." The woman paused, her eyes meeting Vasquez's with surgical precision. "Or you can remember what it feels like to matter again." The base's afternoon traffic rumbled past the window, ordinary sounds of ordinary life continuing while extraordinary choices hung in recycled air. Vasquez had spent 18 months wondering if she'd imagined the whole thing, if the official reports were right, and she really had suffered some kind of breakdown over Afghanistan's unforgiving terrain. But looking at this woman's face, seeing recognition in her eyes, Vasquez knew her memories were real. The cover-up was real. And whatever lay inside this folder was about to make her matter in ways she'd never imagined. She opened the folder. Inside were satellite photographs of a facility that shouldn't exist, nestled in mountainous terrain she didn't recognize. The structures looked military but wrong somehow, too angular, too precise, built with the kind of resources that bypassed normal procurement channels. Personnel files showed faces she didn't know, but uniforms she recognized, all bearing insignia that had been officially discontinued 15 years ago. "Project Shadowfall," the woman said quietly, "officially terminated in 2009 after budget cuts and strategic realignment. Unofficially, relocated to somewhere the Senate Armed Services Committee can't ask questions." She gestured toward the photographs. 3 days ago, we lost contact with the facility. Satellite imagery shows the defensive perimeter intact, but no movement, no communications, nothing. It's like everyone inside simply vanished. Vasquez studied the photos with a pilot's eye, noting landing strips carved into impossible terrain and structures that defied conventional military architecture. What kind of facility needs this level of isolation? The kind that develops assets Congress would never approve and weapons systems that violate treaties we've publicly signed. The woman's voice carried the weight of institutional secrets. The kind that employs people who officially died in combat years ago but continue serving their country in ways that can never be acknowledged. The implications hit Vasquez like turbulence at 30,000 feet. You're talking about ghost soldiers, black operations so deep they don't appear on any budget, answering to agencies that don't officially exist. And now they've gone silent. The woman leaned closer, her voice dropping to barely above a whisper. We need someone to fly reconnaissance, assess the situation, and report back through channels that bypass normal command structure. Someone with combat experience, someone who understands that some missions require moral flexibility. Vasquez turned to the next page and found her own personnel file, but not the sanitized version she'd seen in HR meetings. This file contained details about Kandahar that had been classified above her clearance level, mission parameters that had been redacted from her own after-action reports. Her hands began to shake as she read operational summaries that contradicted everything she'd been told about her final tour. You remember now, the woman observed with clinical detachment. The village that wasn't supposed to exist, the targets that weren't on any map, the orders that came through encrypted channels with authentication codes you'd never seen before. The memory crashed back like a system's failure at altitude, coordinates that led to a facility hidden in Afghan mountains, structures that looked exactly like the ones in these photographs. She'd been ordered to provide close air support for a ground team that officially didn't exist, engaging hostiles who were using weapons systems that shouldn't have been available to insurgent forces. When she'd filed her report, asking questions about the mission parameters and the advanced technology she'd witnessed, that's when the administrative reassignment began. They grounded you because you saw too much, the woman continued. But now we need someone who's already been exposed to the truth, someone who can handle classified operations without suffering convenient memory lapses or unfortunate accidents. Vasquez closed the folder, her mind racing through tactical considerations and political implications. What makes you think I won't just turn this over to my commanding officer and let proper channels handle the investigation? The woman's laugh was sharp enough to cut glass. Because proper channels are what got those people disappeared in the first place. Because your commanding officer receives funding from congressional committees who don't know this facility exists. Because the only way to save whoever's left inside is to operate outside the system that's already failed them. The afternoon light streaming through the office windows seemed different now, charged with possibility and danger in equal measure. Vasquez had spent 18 months believing she'd been punished for psychological instability, accepting the diagnosis because the alternative meant acknowledging her government had systematically lied to her about missions she'd risked her life completing. Now she understood the truth was worse than either option. When do I leave? She asked, her voice steady despite the earthquake reshaping everything she thought she knew about her service record. The woman smiled, and for the first time it reached her eyes. Your flight suit's being prepared now. We launch at 2100 hours. She stood to leave, then paused at the doorway. Your call sign was Reaper, wasn't it? Before they grounded you and tried to make you forget who you were. Vasquez nodded, feeling something inside her chest unfurl like wings remembering how to catch wind. Still is. Good, because where you're going, death follows close behind, and we need someone who isn't afraid to look it in the eye. The woman disappeared into the corridor, leaving behind only questions and the scent of secrets that had been buried too long in bureaucratic soil. Reaper sat alone with the red folder, watching shadows lengthen across her desk while considering how completely her world had shifted in the span of 10 minutes. Tomorrow, she would climb back into a cockpit and fly toward answers that might destroy everything she believed about honor, duty, and the cost of serving a democracy that operated through deliberate shadows. But tonight, for the first time in 18 months, she felt alive. The secure hangar at Ramstein's southern perimeter existed on no official base maps, accessible only through maintenance tunnels that required biometric clearance and security codes, changed daily by personnel who didn't appear on any roster. Reaper followed her escort through concrete corridors lit by industrial fixtures that threw harsh shadows against bare walls, her flight bag slung over one shoulder, and her mind churning with operational parameters that made no tactical sense. The woman from the office, who'd finally introduced herself as Agent Collins, had briefed her during the drive across base, sharing intelligence fragments that painted a picture of Project Shadowfall as something between legitimate defense research and violations of every international treaty the United States had signed since World War II. The facility had been conducting enhanced interrogation research and advanced weapon system development, using funding streams that originated in congressional black budgets but flowed through corporate entities that existed only on paper. 3 days ago, all communications ceased, Collins had explained while navigating security checkpoints that didn't officially exist. No distress calls, no scheduled reports, no response to direct inquiries. Satellite surveillance shows the facility intact but empty, like everyone inside simply evaporated. Now, standing before an aircraft that definitely wasn't in any Air Force inventory, Reaper understood why they'd needed someone already compromised by classified exposure. The machine before her looked like a fusion of technologies that shouldn't exist together. The sleek profile of an F-22 Raptor, married to propulsion systems that belonged to experimental craft she'd only heard whispered about in test pilot circles. Modified F-22X, Collins said, nodding her stare. Radar signature smaller than a sparrow, electronic warfare capabilities that can blind satellites, and range that'll get you to target and back, without requiring tanker support that might appear on flight logs someone could subpoena. Chief Master Sergeant Rodriguez emerged from beneath the aircraft, wiping hydraulic fluid from his hands with a rag that had seen better decades. His face was weathered by 30 years of military service, but his eyes held the sharp alertness of someone who'd never stopped paying attention to details that kept pilots alive. "She's ready, Colonel," Rodriguez said, his voice carrying the respectful familiarity of enlisted personnel addressing an officer they actually trusted. "All systems green, full fuel load, electronic countermeasures package uploaded with the latest threat parameters." He paused, studying her face with the diagnostic intensity of a master mechanic examining a critical component. "Been a while since you've flown combat missions." It wasn't a question. Rodriguez had the kind of institutional memory that tracked which pilots were grounded, promoted, or disappeared into administrative positions after asking inconvenient questions. Reaper nodded, feeling rust in muscles she hadn't used for tactical flying since returning from Afghanistan, with a head full of classified nightmares and a service record that had been systematically sanitized. "Like riding a bicycle," she said, though they both knew aerial combat was nothing like riding bicycles. It was more like dancing with physics while someone shot at you, requiring reflexes that atrophied without constant practice and situational awareness that could only be maintained through regular exposure to mortal danger. Collins consulted her tablet, cross-referencing coordinates with satellite imagery that updated in real time. "Weather window opens in 30 minutes. You'll fly nap of the Earth through Canadian airspace, then polar route to avoid Russian surveillance coverage. Total flight time 8 hours, with the target facility located in terrain that's officially designated as uninhabitable wilderness." Reaper accepted the mission parameters, but something in Collins' tone suggested information being deliberately withheld. What kind of resistance should I expect? Unknown. Colin's response was too quick, too practiced, the kind of non-answer that meant intelligence existed but had been classified beyond the pilot's clearance level. The facility was defended by security contractors who don't officially work for any government agency, using equipment that isn't supposed to exist. If they're still operational, they might not distinguish between authorized reconnaissance and hostile intrusion. Rodriguez handed Reaper her helmet, modified with communication systems that could transmit on frequencies reserved for operations that never appeared in official logs. The weight felt familiar in her hands, like greeting an old friend who'd witnessed too many secrets. Weapons package is configured for air-to-ground engagement if necessary, he said quietly. Just remember, if you have to fire those missiles, there won't be any record of where they came from or where they went. The implications settled around her like flight suit fabric, comfortable but confining. This mission existed in the spaces between official policy and operational necessity, where actions taken in service of national security might technically constitute violations of law, treaty, and congressional oversight. She was being asked to risk her life for an operation that might be disavowed the moment it became politically inconvenient. But standing in this unauthorized hangar, surrounded by people whose jobs required them to pretend certain things didn't exist, Reaper felt more like herself than she had in 18 months of typing reports and attending briefings about missions she wasn't allowed to fly. Whatever waited in that mountain facility, whatever had happened to the personnel who'd vanished without explanation, it was real in ways that her desk job had never been. She strapped on the helmet and began her pre-flight checklist, muscle memory taking over as her hands moved across systems that hummed with lethal purpose. The F-22X responded to her touch like a thoroughbred that had been waiting too long in the stable, every control surface and electronic system singing in harmony as she taxied toward a runway that didn't appear on any air traffic control frequency. The modified Raptor felt different from standard aircraft she'd flown, more responsive, more alive, as if the classified modifications had given it capabilities that bordered on the supernatural. "Reaper, this is Ghost Tower," came the voice through her headset, using call signs that existed only for this mission and would be retired the moment she returned. "You are cleared for immediate departure, flight plan filed through channels that don't require congressional notification. Weather is clear, winds favorable, and you have approximately 6 hours of darkness for approach and reconnaissance." She advanced the throttles and felt the familiar surge of acceleration that had been missing from her life for too long. The runway lights blurred past as the aircraft lifted into night sky that stretched toward horizons where answers waited like landmines buried in political terrain. Behind her, Ramstein Air Base fell away into patterns of light that looked almost innocent from altitude, as if the secrets hidden in underground facilities and unauthorized hangars were just normal military operations conducted by people with nothing to hide. But ahead lay mountains where her government had built something that Congress didn't know about, staffed with personnel who'd officially died years ago, conducting research that violated treaties signed by presidents who'd never been briefed on its actual scope. Whatever had happened to those people, whatever had made an entire facility go silent without distress calls or emergency protocols, it was connected to the mission that had gotten her grounded after asking too many questions about targets that weren't supposed to exist. "Ghost Tower, Reaper is airborne and climbing to mission altitude," she reported, settling into the rhythm of long-range flight while her mind processed tactical scenarios that ranged from equipment failure to hostile action. "ETA to target area 0430 local time." "Copy, Reaper. Remember, this is reconnaissance only unless you encounter immediate threat to your aircraft. Rules of engagement are classified, but use your best judgment regarding survival priorities." The transmission ended, leaving her alone with engine noise and the vast darkness of Canadian wilderness passing beneath her aircraft. Use your best judgment. In military parlance, That phrase meant she was authorized to make decisions that might technically exceed her official authority, as long as she was prepared to accept responsibility for consequences that might include congressional hearings, international incidents, or obituaries that listed her cause of death as training accident. She adjusted course slightly, following GPS coordinates toward terrain that had been selected specifically, because no civilian aircraft had reason to overfly it, and no commercial satellites maintained regular coverage. The facility had been built in a geographic blind spot, hidden from oversight by congressional committees who couldn't investigate facilities they didn't know existed. But as she flew deeper into wilderness that maps showed as empty space, Reaper couldn't shake the feeling that she was heading toward answers that might prove more dangerous than the questions that had gotten her grounded. Whatever Project Shadowfall had been developing in those mountain laboratories, whatever research had required personnel who'd been officially declared dead, it was connected to missions like the one in Afghanistan that had shown her glimpses of technology and capabilities that shouldn't exist. Now she was flying toward the source of those capabilities, armed with weapons that didn't officially exist, following orders issued by agencies that operated beyond congressional oversight, to investigate the disappearance of personnel who were supposed to already be dead. The absurdity would have been laughable if it weren't so terrifying. 4 hours into the flight, Reaper began her descent toward coordinates that satellite imagery showed as pristine wilderness, but her aircraft's advanced sensors were painting a different picture entirely. The mountains ahead contained structures hidden beneath camouflage that could fool orbital reconnaissance, along with electronic signatures that indicated power generation facilities large enough to support a small city. Whatever Project Shadowfall had been doing in this remote location, it had required infrastructure investments that bypassed normal military procurement channels and congressional appropriation processes. Ghost Tower, Reaper approaching target area, she transmitted on frequencies that existed only for this mission. Passive sensors are detecting significant electromagnetic activity inconsistent with uninhabited terrain. Recommend upgrading mission status to active reconnaissance with defensive countermeasures authorized. The response took longer than normal, suggesting consultation with command authority that required security clearances above her operational level. When it came, Colin's voice carried tension that hadn't been present during her initial briefing. Reaper, be advised that facility personnel may not respond normally to standard identification protocols. Project Shadowfall was developing enhanced interrogation techniques that could affect judgment and memory. Approach with extreme caution. Enhanced interrogation techniques that could affect judgment and memory. The euphemism settled in her stomach like ice water as she processed implications that connected her current mission to classified research she'd witnessed in Afghanistan. The village that wasn't supposed to exist, the targets using advanced weapons systems, the orders that came through channels she'd never seen before. All of it pointed toward military operations that existed in spaces between official policy and operational necessity. She activated the aircraft's stealth systems and began her approach, flying nap of the earth through mountain valleys, while her sensors mapped terrain that showed clear evidence of human modification, despite appearing natural from orbital surveillance. Roads had been carved into mountainsides using techniques that left minimal scarring. Power lines had been buried beneath rock formations that looked untouched by civilization, and landing strips had been disguised as natural clearings that could accommodate aircraft much larger than her modified Raptor. Ghost Tower, I have visual on target facility, she reported, studying structures that defied conventional military architecture through her aircraft's enhanced optics. Complex appears intact but shows no signs of current habitation. No vehicle movement, no personnel visible, no thermal signatures indicating active life support systems. The buildings looked wrong somehow, too angular, too precise, constructed using materials that seemed to absorb light rather than reflecting it. Whatever research had been conducted here, It had required facilities that could remain hidden from satellite surveillance while supporting operations that generated electromagnetic signatures visible from orbit. The contradiction suggested technology applications that existed beyond her clearance level and probably beyond her comprehension. She completed her first reconnaissance pass, noting defensive positions that were empty but appeared to have been abandoned recently rather than gradually. Equipment remained in place, vehicles were parked in orderly formations, and structures showed no signs of damage or forced entry. It was as if everyone had simply walked away from their posts without completing normal shutdown procedures or securing classified materials. Ghost Tower facility appears abandoned but not damaged. Recommend ground-level investigation to determine fate of personnel and secure any classified materials that may have been left unsecured. She paused, studying readings from her electronic warfare systems that indicated surveillance equipment was still operating despite the absence of personnel to monitor it. Be advised, automated defense systems appear to be active and tracking my aircraft. The response came with bureaucratic precision that meant decisions were being made by committees who'd never flown combat missions or investigated facilities that weren't supposed to exist. Reaper, you are not authorized for ground investigation. Complete aerial reconnaissance and return to base for debriefing. But as she banked for another pass, something caught her attention. A figure standing motionless on the facility's main landing pad, too distant to identify but clearly human in profile. She activated her aircraft's most powerful optical systems and zoomed in on what appeared to be a person in military fatigues, standing at attention as if waiting for her arrival. Ghost Tower, I have a person on the ground. Single individual, appears to be military personnel, standing in open area as if signaling for contact. She felt her pulse quicken as tactical training ward with mission parameters that hadn't anticipated finding survivors. Request permission to establish communication and assess personnel status. The silence that followed lasted longer than any radio protocol allowed, suggesting consultation with authority levels that existed above normal military command structure. When Collins finally responded, her voice carried the weight of decisions that could end careers or start congressional investigations. Reaper, you are authorized for limited ground contact only if you can maintain aircraft security and egress capability. Do not enter any structures or remain on ground longer than necessary for personnel assessment. She initiated landing procedures while studying the solitary figure through her optics, noting posture and positioning that seemed wrong for someone who'd survived whatever had happened to the rest of the facility's population. The person stood too straight, too motionless, like a mannequin positioned for display rather than a human being responding to the arrival of rescue aircraft. As her wheels touched down on tarmac that should have shown signs of maintenance neglect, but appeared recently serviced, Reaper realized she was no longer conducting reconnaissance of an abandoned facility. She was walking into a situation that had been carefully arranged by someone who'd anticipated her arrival and prepared accordingly. The figure waiting for her wore the uniform of a United States Army major, with insignia that indicated Special Forces qualification and deployment ribbons that told stories of classified operations in countries where American personnel weren't supposed to be conducting military actions. But as she approached with her sidearm drawn and tactical awareness heightened by years of combat experience, she noticed details that triggered every survival instinct she developed during 2 decades of military service. The major's uniform was pristine despite evidence of recent combat activity around the facility. His posture remained unnaturally rigid despite the obvious stress of being the sole survivor of whatever had decimated his unit, and his eyes held the unfocused stare of someone who wasn't entirely present behind them. When he spoke, his voice carried the mechanical precision of someone reciting memorized responses rather than communicating genuine information. Lieutenant Colonel Vasquez, he said, somehow knowing her name despite the fact that her mission existed outside normal command channels. "I am Major Davidson, officer in charge of facility security during the incident that resulted in the loss of our personnel. I have been instructed to brief you on operational parameters that require immediate command attention." Something about his phrasing triggered alarm bells that had kept her alive through multiple combat tours. Nobody talked like that unless they were either reading from a script or had suffered psychological trauma that affected normal communication patterns. Either scenario suggested complications that hadn't been included in her mission briefing. "Major, what happened to the rest of your personnel?" she asked, maintaining tactical distance while scanning for threats that might not be immediately visible. My briefing indicated total communications blackout followed by apparent facility abandonment. Davidson's response came without hesitation, but his tone remained unnaturally flat. Project Shadowfall achieved breakthrough results in enhanced interrogation research that exceeded operational parameters. Personnel were relocated to secondary facilities for medical evaluation and debriefing. I remained behind to brief designated reconnaissance personnel regarding classified materials that require immediate command attention. The explanation felt rehearsed, too convenient, like testimony that had been crafted to satisfy investigators without revealing actionable intelligence. Reaper had heard similar responses during congressional hearings, where witnesses used technically accurate statements to avoid discussing classified operations that might trigger oversight investigations. But standing on this remote landing pad, surrounded by facilities that contained evidence of research that violated multiple international treaties, she wasn't conducting a hearing. She was trying to determine whether Major Davidson represented a security asset or a threat that had been positioned to intercept her mission. "Major, I need you to show me the classified materials you mentioned. Then we're both returning to my aircraft for immediate extraction." She gestured toward the F-22X, whose engines remained spooled up for rapid departure. "Can you comply with that instruction?" For the first time, Davidson's mechanical composure flickered, replaced by an expression that suggested internal conflict between competing sets of instructions. When he spoke again, his voice carried undertones of strain that indicated psychological pressure beyond normal operational stress. "The classified materials are located in underground storage areas that require biometric access. You must accompany me to the secure vault in order to complete your reconnaissance mission." His eyes remained unfocused, but she caught glimpses of something that might have been genuine desperation. "The materials cannot be transported without proper containment protocols." Reaper weighed tactical options against mission requirements, knowing that entering underground facilities would compromise her ability to maintain aircraft security and egress capability. But Major Davidson represented the only human intelligence available regarding whatever had happened to Project Shadowfall, and his obvious psychological distress suggested he might have information that could prevent similar incidents at other classified facilities. "Major, before we go anywhere, I need you to answer some basic questions to verify your identity and assess your current mental status." She maintained her tactical stance while studying his responses for indicators of deception or psychological manipulation. "What was your primary mission assignment before the communications blackout?" Davidson's answer came too quickly, with details that were too specific for spontaneous recall. "Security oversight for research conducted by Dr. Sarah Chen regarding neural pathway modification techniques that could enhance interrogation effectiveness while maintaining plausible deniability regarding human rights violations. The research achieved breakthrough results that exceeded all projected parameters." The name hit her like defensive fire at close range. Dr. Sarah Chen had been mentioned in classified briefings she'd received before her final Afghanistan deployment, identified as a researcher developing advanced interrogation techniques that could extract actionable intelligence without leaving evidence of torture or coercion. But Chen had reportedly been killed in a vehicle accident 3 months ago, according to official reports that had been classified above Reaper's normal clearance level. Major, Dr. Chen is deceased according to official records, she said carefully, watching for his reaction to information that contradicted his briefing. Are you saying she was working at this facility after her reported death? Davidson's mechanical composure completely collapsed, replaced by expressions that cycled rapidly between confusion, terror, and something that looked like recognition breaking through psychological barriers. Chen. Chen is. The research. They made us forget. But you're asking questions that trigger the memories they tried to suppress. His voice trailed off into whispers that suggested internal dialogue, with thoughts or memories that had been deliberately obscured. Whatever enhanced interrogation techniques had been developed at Project Shadowfall, they had apparently been tested on the facility's own personnel with results that left Major Davidson psychologically compromised, but still functional enough to serve as a briefing asset for investigating personnel. Reaper realized she wasn't just investigating the disappearance of research personnel. She was looking at evidence that her own government had developed psychological weapons that could be used against American military personnel, tested on soldiers who'd been assigned to classified operations, specifically because their deaths or disappearances wouldn't trigger oversight investigations. The scope of the implications made her earlier concerns about congressional testimony seem quaint by comparison. Major, I'm going to help you, but I need you to show me exactly what happened in that facility, she said, making a tactical decision that violated her explicit mission parameters, but aligned with her oath to protect American personnel regardless of classification levels. Can you take me to the research areas without compromising our safety? Davidson nodded with mechanical precision, but his eyes showed flickers of personality that suggested the real person was still present somewhere beneath layers of psychological conditioning. The underground levels contain evidence of everything they did to us, everything they made us forget, everything they're planning to do to other facilities. His voice dropped to barely above whisper. But you have to understand, Colonel, once you see what's down there, they'll never let you go back to typing reports and pretending none of this exists. She looked back at her aircraft, knowing that her next decision would determine whether she completed a routine reconnaissance mission or crossed a line that would make her complicit in operations that existed beyond congressional oversight and constitutional authority. But Major Davidson's obvious distress, combined with evidence that American personnel had been subjected to experimental procedures that violated every principle she'd sworn to defend, made the choice inevitable. Show me, she said, following him toward structures that contained answers she might not survive learning. The elevator descended through solid rock for what felt like miles, its smooth operation suggesting engineering capabilities that exceeded anything in Reaper's experience with military construction projects. The shaft had been carved with precision that required technology beyond conventional excavation equipment, creating a perfectly circular passage that descended into mountain depths where no natural cave system should exist. Major Davidson stood beside her with posture that remained unnaturally rigid, but his psychological composure continued deteriorating as they moved deeper into the facility. Whatever conditioning had been applied to suppress his memories appeared to weaken with proximity to the research areas where those memories had been formed. Level 1 housed administrative functions and personnel quarters, he said, his voice regaining traces of normal military bearing as they passed floors marked only with numbers that provided no indication of their actual function. Level 2 contained standard interrogation facilities and holding cells for subjects who were processed using conventional techniques. The elevator continued its descent through rock that showed tool marks consistent with advanced boring equipment, but the precision of the excavation suggested capabilities that belonged to engineering projects with budgets that bypassed normal congressional appropriation processes. whatever Project Shadowfall had been authorized to accomplish. It had required infrastructure investment that could only be justified by anticipated results that exceeded conventional military applications. Level 3 through 7 were Dr. Chen's primary research areas, Davidson continued, but his voice now carried undertones of distress that suggested memories breaking through psychological barriers. That's where they developed the neural pathway modification techniques, where they tested them on volunteer subjects, where they discovered applications that exceeded original project parameters. His words trailed off as the elevator stopped at level 5, its doors opening to reveal corridors that looked more like hospital wards than military research facilities. The lighting was soft and indirect, designed to minimize stress responses in subjects who might be experiencing psychological trauma, and the air carried the antiseptic smell of medical facilities that processed large numbers of patients through procedures that required extensive sterilization protocols. But underlying the medical atmosphere was something else, an electronic humming that suggested equipment operating beyond normal hospital applications, along with the subtle ozone smell that accompanied high-voltage electrical systems running at power levels that could affect biological functions. This is where they brought the subjects for initial conditioning, Davidson said, leading her down corridors lined with rooms that looked like luxury hotel suites, but contained observation equipment hidden behind mirrors and artwork. Dr. Chen's research required subjects to remain calm and cooperative throughout procedures that could take weeks or months to complete. Reaper studied the rooms through reinforced glass windows, noting amenities that would have been expensive in civilian facilities, but represented massive budget allocations for military research projects. Each suite contained entertainment systems, exercise equipment, and furnishings that suggested long-term occupancy by personnel who were being housed rather than imprisoned. These looked like VIP quarters, not holding cells, she observed, trying to reconcile the comfortable accommodations with research that had apparently involved experimental procedures performed on American military personnel. Davidson's response came with mechanical precision, but his eyes showed increasing signs of internal conflict. Dr. Chen discovered that traditional interrogation techniques produced unreliable results because subjects experienced psychological stress that interfered with memory access and truth verification. Her research focused on creating environments where subjects would voluntarily cooperate with procedures they wouldn't normally accept. The implications settled around her like flight suit fabric, familiar but constraining. Enhanced interrogation techniques that could extract information without triggering psychological resistance, applied to subjects who'd been housed in conditions that made them feel safe and comfortable while their memories were systematically accessed and potentially modified. They continued deeper into the level, passing laboratories that contained equipment she didn't recognize, but that generated electromagnetic signatures consistent with devices designed to interface with biological systems. Computer terminals displayed data streams that included biological readings, heart rate, brain activity, neurochemical levels, monitored in real time from subjects who were apparently conscious and ambulatory during whatever procedures were being performed. "Major, where are the research subjects now?" she asked, noting that the monitoring systems were still active despite the apparent abandonment of the facility. "The equipment suggests ongoing biological monitoring, but I haven't seen any personnel since we arrived." Davidson stopped walking, his mechanical composure completely collapsing as memory fragments apparently broke through psychological conditioning that had been designed to prevent him from discussing classified operational details. "They're still here, Colonel. All of them. Dr. Chen's research achieved breakthrough results in neural pathway modification, but the success exceeded projected parameters." His voice dropped to barely above whisper as he gestured toward corridors that extended beyond the range of overhead lighting. The subjects didn't just cooperate with interrogation procedures. they became psychologically incapable of functioning independently of the research protocols. They can't leave the facility because their modified neural pathways can't process environments that exist outside the conditioning parameters. Reaper felt ice water in her stomach as she processed implications that connected her current mission to classified operations she'd witnessed in Afghanistan. Enhanced interrogation techniques that could modify memory and judgment, tested on American military personnel who'd been selected for classified assignments specifically because their disappearances wouldn't trigger oversight investigations. Major, are you saying that Dr. Chen created a form of psychological dependency that prevents the research subjects from leaving this facility? She asked, knowing the answer but needing confirmation of what she was witnessing. Davidson nodded with movements that seemed to cause him physical pain. The neural pathway modifications were designed to enhance cooperation and truth-telling during interrogation procedures, but they also eliminated the subject's ability to function in environments that didn't provide constant psychological reinforcement. They became dependent on the research protocols for basic decision-making and emotional regulation. The elevator descended further, past levels that contained evidence of research projects that had systematically violated every principle she'd sworn to defend during her military career. Whatever oversight committees had authorized Project Shadowfall, they had created a situation where American personnel had been subjected to experimental procedures that removed their psychological autonomy while leaving them physically capable of performing complex tasks. She was looking at evidence of psychological weapons that could transform military personnel into assets who couldn't question orders or refuse instructions, all conducted under the auspices of enhanced interrogation research that had been classified beyond congressional oversight. The scope of the violations made her earlier concerns about unauthorized reconnaissance seem trivial by comparison. Level 7 contained Dr. Chen's primary laboratory, and the moment they entered the main research area, Reaper understood why Major Davidson had been left as the sole conscious personnel to brief investigating officers. The room was filled with medical equipment designed to interface with human neural systems, along with computer terminals that displayed brain activity patterns of subjects who were apparently still connected to monitoring systems, despite the facility's apparent abandonment. Dr. Chen's final breakthrough came 3 days ago, Davidson said, his voice now carrying undertones of genuine terror that suggested he was remembering events he'd been conditioned to forget. She discovered that the neural pathway modifications could be transmitted electronically, without requiring direct physical contact with subjects or conventional conditioning procedures. Electronic transmission of neural pathway modifications. The implications exploded in her mind like surface-to-air missiles detonating at close range. If the research had achieved the capability to modify human neural patterns remotely, it represented a psychological weapon that could be applied to entire populations without their knowledge or consent. She studied computer terminals that showed brain activity patterns of multiple subjects,